That sound, that ragged breath on the cold air, that was the first thing Eli heard that morning. It wasn't the wind, which was a constant companion out here on the western edge of the Wyoming Territory. It was the sound of a life, clinging on by a thread. Eli was a man carved from the very landscape he tended. His face was a road map of sun and solitude. His hands were leather. His soul was as weathered as the fence posts that marked his claim. His ranch was small, just a few hundred acres of tough grass and a stubborn creek, a tiny island of what he called civilization in a vast whispering ocean of wilderness. He was a man who understood the economy of things. You worked, you earned, you protected what was yours. And in the year 1874, what was yours was often all you had. He was mending a harness when he heard it again, a soft, guttural moan coming from the cluster of cottonwoods down by the creek. His hand went to the worn stock of his rifle, leaning against the corral post. Every instinct, every story whispered in trading posts and shouted in crowded saloons told him to be cautious. The land was uneasy. Stories of skirmishes, of stolen cattle and retaliatory raids hung in the air like wood smoke. But another instinct, older and deeper, stirred in him. The instinct that made him shelter a newborn lamb in a blizzard, that made him dig a well for a strayed antelope. It was the simple, unadorned recognition of suffering. He moved slowly, the dry grass crunching under his boots, and there, nestled in the roots of the oldest cottonwood, he saw him, a man lying on his side. His clothing was torn, dark with dried blood and dirt. His long black hair was matted against a forehead beaded with sweat, despite the chill. An arrow shaft, snapped short, was buried deep in his shoulder. He was a Shoshone, one of the people of the valley. Eli's breath caught in his throat. This was the enemy the stories warned him about, the savage, the threat. But looking down, Eli didn't see a savage. He saw a man, maybe 10 years his junior, his eyes clouded with pain and fever, his lips cracked and parched. He was just a man, dying alone by a creek that didn't belong to anyone, and yet to everyone. The Shoshone's eyes fluttered open. They held no anger, no plea, just a vast, deep exhaustion. He looked at Eli, at the rifle in his hand, and then closed his eyes again, as if accepting whatever was to come.
Eli stood there for a long minute, a war raging silently within him. The world told him to walk away, to let nature take its course. But his own nature, the one his mother had etched into him with Bible verses and a quiet strength, told him something else. He couldn't let a man die of thirst on his land. He lowered his rifle, leaning it against the tree. He uncorked his canteen, the water inside sloshing a promise of life. He knelt, a move that felt both incredibly foolish and profoundly right. He gently lifted the man's head, bringing the canteen to his lips. "Easy now," Eli murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Easy. Just a little." The man drank, a few small, desperate sips at first, then a longer pull. The water seemed to bring a flicker of awareness back into his eyes. He looked at Eli again, and this time there was something there. Not gratitude, not yet, but a spark of confusion, a reevaluation. Eli knew the arrow had to come out. The wound was festering, the smell of infection already faint in the air. This is gonna hurt," he said, knowing the words wouldn't be understood, but hoping the tone might convey his intention. He used his knife, heated in the flame of a small fire he built, to carefully cut away the flesh around the arrowhead. The Shoshone man gritted his teeth, a low groan escaping his lips, but he didn't struggle. It was as if he understood the grim necessity of the act. With a firm, sickening pull, Eli drew the arrowhead out. He cleaned the wound as best he could with clean water and a strip of cloth from his own shirt, then packed it with a poultice of yarrow he knew grew nearby. He covered the man with his own heavy wool blanket, leaving the canteen by his side. He spent the day tending his chores, but his eyes constantly drifted back to the cottonwood grove. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Had he just saved a man who would return with his warriors to burn him out? Had his mercy signed his own death warrant? That night he slept fitfully, his rifle on the table beside his bed, every creak of the cabin and every howl of a coyote sounding like an approaching war party.
The next morning dawned clear and cold. The silence was different. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the high plains. It was a thick, heavy silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Eli stepped out onto his porch, a cup of bitter coffee in his hand, and he froze. There, on the ridge line to the east, a line appeared, then another, and another. Not a line, a horizon made of men and horses, dozens of them, maybe 100. Shoshone warriors, sitting tall on painted ponies, their lances pointing to the sky, their faces painted for war. The morning sun glinted off beads and weaponry. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the silent, terrifying power of their presence. This was it, the consequence of his mercy. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He thought of his wife, taken by fever 2 winters back. He was almost glad she wasn't here to see this. He was a dead man. He only had a few bullets. He could make a stand in the cabin, but it would be a short, brutal one. There was no running. He set his coffee cup down on the porch rail, his hand trembling only slightly. He would meet his end on his feet. He walked out into the yard, standing alone in the open space between his cabin and the oncoming tide. The warriors began to move. They didn't charge. They flowed down the ridge like a slow, deliberate river, their horses' hooves making a soft, thunderous rumble that shook the ground beneath Eli's feet. They surrounded his small ranch, a silent, impassable circle of muscle, hide, and grim-faced intention. The world had shrunk to this dusty yard, and the circle was closing. Then the circle parted, and through the gap the man Eli had saved walked forward. He was clean, his hair braided, a fresh, clean bandage visible on his shoulder. He walked with a strength that seemed impossible from the broken figure of the day before. He stopped a few feet from Eli, his dark eyes holding the rancher's. And then he did something Eli would never forget, not for all the days of his life. He placed his hand over his own heart, and then he extended that hand, open and empty, towards Eli. From behind him, an older man, his face a mask of wise, deep-lined authority, rode forward. His headdress was not of war, but of honor, adorned with eagle feathers and ermine. He was the chief. He looked from the healed warrior to Eli, and then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the silence. "My son," he said, in halting but clear English. He tells a story of a white man who saw not an enemy but a man, who gave water and healing when he could have given death.
The chief gestured, and two younger warriors rode forward. They were not carrying weapons. They were leading two beautiful, strong-limbed Appaloosa horses, their coats dappled like sunlight on water. And draped across the backs of the horses were piles of the most exquisite goods Eli had ever seen. Thick, beautifully tanned buffalo robes, intricately beaded garments, and a woven pouch that, when one of the warriors opened it, revealed a fortune in glistening, fresh river pelts. "The people do not forget," the chief said, his voice firm. "A life for a life. This is our way. You have shown the heart of a man. You are not Taivo, white man, to us. You are a friend. Your water is our water. Your land is under our protection. No harm will come to you from our people for as long as the rivers flow and the eagles nest in these mountains." Eli stood, utterly stunned, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. The fear that had gripped him melted away, replaced with a profound, humbling awe. He had expected violence, and he was given a brotherhood. He had expected to lose everything, and he was given more wealth in spirit and in substance than he had ever dreamed of. The warriors didn't stay long. As silently as they had come, they turned their horses and flowed back over the ridge, until the last of them disappeared, and the land was silent once more. But the silence was different now. It was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. It was full. Eli lived on that ranch for another 30 years. He never had trouble with the Shoshone. In fact, they became his neighbors, his trading partners, his quiet guardians. The two Appaloosas became the foundation of his herd, their strong bloodline mixing with his own stock. We look back on those times, and we see the lines drawn in the history books. We see the conflicts, the wars, the unbreachable divide between the settlers and the tribes. And all of that is true. The history was written in blood and tears. But this story was written in water. A simple human act of mercy that transcended the boundaries of language and fear. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how many other stories were lost? How many small, quiet acts of humanity were swallowed by the louder narratives of conquest and conflict? Eli's story is a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of our past, there were flickers of light. That a single choice, a single cup of water offered in the face of fear, can change the course of a life and echo through generations.
He never became a rich man by the world's standards, but he died a wealthy one. He had learned the most valuable lesson the West, in all its brutal beauty, could ever teach, that the true frontier isn't a line on a map. It's the space between one heart and another. And sometimes all it takes to cross it is a little kindness.